Always find a way to cope. We cry, we mourn.
Districts to cope with this depending on what their own demographic
period of time. How do we cope with those challenges, do you think?
They have to cope just as those struggling for civil rights in the 60s had to cope with getting on.
To be able to cope on all these fronts.
Well,
skills, sharing family meals whenever you can, allowing children to experience frustration and cope with disappointment, helping.
and maybe this is just the way I cope with life and decision making, but I feel like if
believe something insane and how to cope. I'm going to talk today about
a human being who's trying to cope with death, old girlfriend.
How will she cope? And will she be as fearless as Isadora Wing was? Fear of dying has just...
What were some of the healing mechanisms that you use to cope with trauma? What advice would you use?
A peer visiting group brought the How to Cope with Limb Loss. You threw it behind your shoulder.
Fluent. So that's how we cope with linguistic stage fright, with linguistic performance anxiety.
And that helped me to cope. One thing I say about the Black church.
Confident, they cope with this moment totally fine. And then there are other people.
The present, but how do you act now to help yourself cope with unpredictable
kind of pain and you don't know what to do with it? You find a way to cope. You find a way to go on. You find some kind of mask, a place to...
And the cameras could cope with stage lighting levels. One had to go in.
Keynesian economics was an attempt to cope with it. Didn't work out.
To cope in society as normal, because as humans age,
that historically people cope, you know, in the chapter on how we cope, is by, you know, structure.
Couldn't cope with life without, you know, the way things.
Can, you know, the degree to which you can kind of register and cope with all the language variety.
To us, and it's the way we cope with it. I know that sounds real.
And help you to cope with pain. This system is similar.
Cope with the changes better. And it's the poor who will be
culture in many ways and how we cope with what we see. Now,
die, but it can become a way in which they cope with distress or overwhelming negative.
After he said he could no longer cope with some of the material coming.
In the Russian psychology, read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Russians are very tough-minded people who can cope with adversity. So it's worth understanding that as you think about the sanction effect. Absurdistan is
emotions. They may cope with them differently. We are different.
Christmas sales, we cope with all that sort of stuff. It's the length of time which is different, and perhaps the geographic.
And I couldn't cope with the fact that the daughter of the two main characters.
And that's the role of anxiety. It can help them to cope better with stress.
For a while, for a couple.
It may have plans to teach them coping strategies so they can learn to cope better in the future with situations that are difficult.
And they often ask me, how do you cope? What do I do? And I like to use the